If you've listened to a lot of episodes of this show, then you know I like talking about the Civil War. And a lot of times I just kind of dabble it in there, or I'll mention that the Civil War took place, or maybe something happened just during those 4 years. But today, we're going all in, because I'm talking about the largest Civil War battle that took place in North Carolina. And that battle, of course, is Bentonville. Welcome to the NC Everything Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis, and this is the bi-weekly show where I talk about everything that has anything to do with North Carolina. Now, as usual, I want to get into the promotions and all that stuff, but we do have a lot of information to cover today. So if you don't want to hear any of this, or you're on your way to work, go ahead and look in the description, and you'll see where the actual content starts, and you can skip through all of it. But I do have a little bit of personal story to tell, not a bad one, but a little bit of personal stuff to tell before we get into it. First, I want to say, if you like the show, hit the subscribe button, and you can rate in some of the podcast players. You can rate and review. If you do that, it'll really help the show and help people find the show. Also, if you're listening and you want to watch, I have a YouTube channel. And if you're watching and you'd rather listen, you can search me in most podcast players. There's also a Facebook group. You can search the NC Everything Podcast on Facebook. And there's a website, www.thenceverythingpodcast.com. However, all those links are in the description below. And like I say in every episode, there's also a contact link. Don't be afraid to hit that. I love hearing from you. I've been hearing a lot from my listeners, and I've really enjoyed it. I took a little break from the show, but since I've come back, I've had a lot of interactions with the listeners, and that's been really great. As a matter of fact, one of my more recent subscribers, Brian Dunphy, he invited me on a television interview for the GSO Community TV recently. For you guys listening to this show, it would have been a couple weeks ago. But I went on his TV channel there, and I had a really good chat with Brian and his co-host, John Graham. And we talked for about an hour, had a really good time. They asked about the podcast, and we talked a little bit of personal stuff, and they asked me questions about welding, which is what I do for a living. And it was a really fun time heading up there and talking with those guys. And I'll post a link to that in the description below too. But a lot of you I know have seen it, or it's posted on the Facebook group. And I think that's enough of that. Today we're going to be talking about Bentonville, or the Battle of Bentonville. Now, this was a suggestion by Rip from Smithfield. Thank you, Rip, for the suggestion. Before I talk about the actual battle and get into the content, I want to say a while back I lost my lapel mic. I have another one right here. I lost the one I had, and so I ordered another one. And then I decided to record Bentonville. And the night before I was going to record, my wife, she suggested, or she kind of posed the idea that we could go to the Bentonville battlefield and I could record there. And I couldn't turn it down. I was really excited. So the next morning, real early, I got up, packed all my stuff together, including my new lapel mic that I just bought, and we headed down there. Now, keep in mind, I had tested the receiver for the lapel mic. I hadn't actually looked at the microphone itself. So we get down there, and we get set up in a really pretty spot, and I go to hook everything up, and the receiver is for an iPhone. I don't have any Apple products at all. And I was really irritated for a few minutes. I was happy to be down there. It was a beautiful day to walk around the battlefield. I was irritated about that. The one good thing is, and I'll have pictures of this, we were down there, and this cat, there's a house nearby, and this cat came out of nowhere, and he hung out with me and my wife and the kids for a few minutes, and the kids were playing with him, and he kept us company while I was fuming over my microphone issue. And anyway, I got over that, and we toured the rest of the battlefield. So during this episode, I'm probably going to try to cast up some videos and images I took at the battlefield. But I came home, and it was yesterday. Yesterday is when we were at the battlefield in my timeline. And my wife had ordered another one for me, and it showed up today, so here I am. I also have this new little clicker toy, so I can stop and start the camera without standing up every time and having to edit all that out. So that should speed things up too. It's a little bit later in the day. You can see the sun behind me if you're watching on YouTube. I was setting up near my tractor again. I kind of like that spot, but the sun was right in my face. Usually I record in the morning, and a few times in the middle of the day. This time I'm in the evening, so it's probably going to get darker on me as we go along. But the reason I'm recording so late is this morning I had to put new spindles on my lawnmower, and of course they didn't work. And then I was working on my kid's four-wheeler, and one thing led to another, and the day just got away from me. And so my microphone literally came in an hour or so ago. I threw it on the charger, and now I'm gonna try to get this recording done before everything goes dead or fails on me, and I'll be back to square one. All right, so let's get into the Battle of Bentonville. Now, a lot of my episodes, I have to do some origin story. I love origin stories. In the Battle of Bentonville, I'm not so much doing an origin story as much as I am giving some backstory. You see, to talk about Bentonville, I have to talk about Aversboro. And before I can talk about Aversboro, I need to talk about Sherman's infamous March to the Sea. So here we go. All right. I was in the house just now doing the editing, and right at the very beginning of the show, I said that the American Civil War was in its third year. And I realized right away that we were in our fourth year. It was 1865, not 1864, which I say a few times in the episode. I just want you to know that part of the script and the notes I was taking, I actually took at probably 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning. So I don't know if I was tired, but what happened was I put the wrong year at the beginning of the script, and it just carried on through there. But the Battle of Bentonville and Aversboro and Sherman's March to the Sea, it all happened in 1865, not 1864. It was the fourth year of the war, not the third. And as we go through this episode, if you're watching on YouTube, you may see some edits pop in where I'm wearing a different outfit like this. But anyway, I just wanted to let you know. The American Civil War, it's in its third year, and the country has seen a lot of death and destruction. Now, some of the worst battles have already been fought and witnessed by many, not just military. You got the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, Pea Ridge, Arkansas, Antietam Creek, or Sharpsburg in Maryland, and of course, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Well, the people, they're getting pretty tired of war, and this is on both sides. Lincoln was desperately trying to end the Civil War, and the soldiers, they were getting tired of fighting the war. The civilians, they were just getting tired of trying to survive every single day. Well, you know how they say desperate times call for desperate measures? Well, we got U.S. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman. He was a West Point graduate from Ohio who, unlike many of his counterparts, didn't participate in the recent Mexican War. However, this didn't mean he wasn't skilled on the battlefield. As a matter of fact, he may have been just as skilled as General Lee himself. Well, in November of 1864, Sherman made a bold decision. He wanted to invade the heart of the Confederacy, despite cutting himself off from additional resources, reinforcements, and even regular communication with his superiors. He planned to march through the South, wreaking as much havoc as possible, and destroy Atlanta, Georgia. Now, his hopes were that by destroying everything in his path, he would send a clear message to the rebels. He wanted to scare the Southerners into giving up this cause, and in destroying Atlanta, he'd be shutting down a major supply hub for the entire Confederacy. And so he set off for Atlanta with 3 armies totaling 100,000 men. He had the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of Ohio, and the Army of Tennessee. He made it to Atlanta and employed Napoleon's ideology of total war. He wanted to destroy everything he saw: bridges, railroads, and homes. After Sherman burnt Atlanta to the ground, he set his sights on Savannah, Georgia, and he began his 285-mile march to the sea. Now, I want to say right here that so far, after Atlanta fell, General Sherman's plan was working, and the rest of the dominoes began to fall. The people of Georgia pretty much gave up on the whole idea of the Confederate States of America. General Lee was now up in Virginia without any way of getting any resources out of Atlanta, and so his men were cut off, starving, and exhausted. And to make matters worse, General U.S. Grant was right on his heels. Well, General Sherman, he made it to Savannah, and he left a wake of destruction in his path. And eventually, on December 21st, 37 days after the fall of Atlanta, Savannah, Georgia also surrendered. So what now? What's the next part of the plan? Well, Sherman wanted to march through South Carolina, then North Carolina, into Virginia, and then he wanted to meet up with Grant for a big old storm the castle party. at the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. But he would never make it to Richmond. Not as a combatant anyway, but I won't spoil the ending. Sherman's army first stepped foot in North Carolina on March 7th, 1865, at a border town named Gibson. This is just west of Laurinburg. 4 days later, Sherman's army took Fayetteville. From here, Sherman planned to split his army up. Now imagine a long line of soldiers, hand in hand, sweeping across the land. This is kind of how Sherman's men were spread. Not really hand in hand, but they were kind of fanned out more or less in like a really long line. The left side, or left wing, they'd head north towards the capital of North Carolina, Raleigh. The right wing would start towards Goldsboro. Now, there is some speculation, or it might be some truth. I couldn't find confirmative information, but there's some speculation that Sherman really had no intentions of going toward Raleigh. He just wanted to put the word out there that he was to get a reaction out of the Confederacy and, make them slip up. And since we brought up the Confederacy, I've talked so far about what Sherman was doing, but what was the Confederacy doing? I mean, outside of Virginia anyway. Well, on the Confederate side, you had General Joseph E. Johnston. Now, he was a native of Farmville, Virginia, and like Sherman, he was a West Point graduate. He was actually in the same graduating class as Robert E. Lee. Well, Johnston had one goal: stop Sherman, or at least slow him down. He could probably tell by now there wasn't a whole lot of stopping Sherman. And that brings us to the Battle of Aversboro down in Harnett County. The whole point of the battle was to slow Sherman down, and buy Johnston some time so his armies that were split up at the time could get together for a bigger defense. Well, the Battle of Aversboro began on March 15th, 1864. And I'll tell you what, for the duration of this episode, I'm going to call the men either U.S. for Union or C.S. for the Confederacy, because I'm going to start calling out some names, and I can't expect you to remember all of who is who. So I just want you to remember which side they're on. So you'll have U.S. or C.S. So on March 15th, C.S. General Johnston gives the order to C.S. Lieutenant Hardee to take the 6,000 men under his command and engage the enemy somewhere near Aversboro. Now, this was the left wing of Sherman's army. So keep in mind, if they're facing each other, U.S. left is fighting C.S. right, C.S. left, U.S. right. Now, his goal was to keep them occupied long enough for C.S. Major General Hoke and Hill to get there from Kinston. Well, C.S. Hardee, finds the enemy and he engages, but pretty soon the sun went down and night fell. The next morning started off with a barrage of artillery and a cavalry charge from the U.S. Well, the Confederates, they were doing pretty good. They were holding the ground until the commander of the left wing, U.S. Major General Slocum, called for reinforcements. His reinforcements showed up, and by the end of that day, the U.S. had pushed the Confederates far enough that C.S. Hardee ordered the retreat. The U.S. lost 682 at Aversboro, and the Confederates lost 400 to 500, depending on the sources. It was a definitive defeat for the South, but like I said, it was really just a stall tactic to prepare for a bigger fight. And it worked. That bigger fight goes down in history as the Battle of Bentonville. Now, it wasn't only one of the last battles fought during the American Civil War. It was the biggest battle fought in North Carolina. We were in Harnett County for Aversboro, but now we're crossing the county line into Johnston County. By the way, it's just a coincidence that C.S. General Johnston is fighting in Johnston County. It was a county long before General Johnston came along. It was actually named for Gabriel Johnston, who was the British royal governor when the county was formed in 1746. Anyway, it's been 4 days since the 6,000 Confederates, except for the ones that were killed, retreated from Aversboro. The Confederate defense has now been consolidated and now numbers 21,000, and they're all hanging out around the town of Bentonville. Remember how I said Sherman's army split up and Aversboro was about stalling the Union Army? Well, the Union Army is still split up, so now the plan is to stop the Union Army from reuniting in Goldsboro. If they can beat the left wing of Sherman's army, then it couldn't reinforce the right wing. So on March 19th, C.S. General Johnston engages the Union. He deploys his men in such a way that it looks kind of like a sickle or a banana. Actually, a sickle's, it sounds more fearsome, so let's go with that. Anyway, you have the sickle blade shape. The left side was commanded by C.S. General Braxton Bragg, also a native of North Carolina, from Warrenton. And he's a namesake of Fort Bragg in Fayetteville. Anyway, some of the men under Braxton Bragg were known as the NC Junior Reserves. These were the youngest soldiers in the Army. A law had been passed requiring 17-year-olds to join the fight, and this was them. C.S. General Hardee, from the Afersboro fight, he was on the right side of the sickle formation. The morning started out with the cavalry. The Confederate cavalry was attacked by Union men, but they held their ground. Then that same cavalry ran into an advancing Union line under U.S. Major General Slocum. And actually, Slocum, General U.S. Slocum, he didn't want to engage the cavalry. See, he received intel that the main concentration of the Confederate Army was near Raleigh, and that's where he was trying to get to. But as you know, the entire Confederate Army was right here in Bentonville. The tip about Raleigh was fake news. Well, U.S. Slocum, he didn't know it was fake at the time, but he soon found out. He skirted the cavalry line to get a bigger fish up in Raleigh, and he ended up walking right into heavy fire. About this time, Slocum got some unusual company. 3 Confederate deserters made it into the Union line. They informed U.S. Slocum that he wasn't facing a company or two, he was in front of the entire Confederate Army. Now, I'll give credit where it's due. U.S. Slocum, he messed up, and he got his hand slapped for it with a lot of bullets. But he didn't turn and run. He dug in and decided to fight it out. But first, he sent for reinforcements. But as you know, these reinforcements, they're not coming in Humvees. They're coming on horseback. So it takes a little while. And until they could get there, U.S. Slocum was on his own. And he wasn't doing too good. The left side of the U.S. line took heavy fire, and it started to fall apart. Eventually, those guys retreated and fell back all the way to the artillery line where the cannons were set up. And if you wanted to be safe, sitting behind the cannons was a pretty good spot. This would have been a really good time for the Confederates to hit that left side and flank U.S. Slocum, but they didn't. I don't know if they didn't realize what was going on or what, but they continued the sporadic attacks right out in front and center instead of trying to do the flank. And keep in mind, there's woods and there's fields, but if you look at any of these battlefields and you see some of the battle maps, there's men everywhere. It's really easy to get confused about who's going which way and where to attack out there. But the Confederates, they didn't perform the flank, and they gave just enough time for the U.S. reinforcements to show up to help Slocum. They refilled that left side, and they held the ground. Now, by this point, the Confederates realized they probably should have hit that left, and they tried a few times, but they couldn't break through before sundown. They pulled back and returned to their battle lines. Now, it was that evening that Sherman finally found out what was going on down there in Bentonville with his left wing. So he tells his right wing to get on over to Bentonville and offer some help. The next day, March 20th, C.S. Johnston gets his men into a V formation, although some people call it a horseshoe. What he's trying to do is make sure if he gets into a V formation, he can kind of still keep that line of retreat open in case it gets kind of sticky, he can still get out. Well, that afternoon, that right wing that Sherman had sent, it finally showed up to help the left wing. Well, keep in mind, the battle's been going on now for a day or so, and Johnston, he's running out of men. He's losing this fight, but he don't want Sherman to know he's losing the fight. And so what he does, he puts cavalry on either side of the V or the horseshoe to cover his flanks. And what this does, it makes it look like he's got more men there than he actually does. So it's just an illusion, really. And the trick worked. Because the cavalry was there and it looked like he had a larger army there fighting than he actually did, Sherman, he didn't order a general attack. Instead, he sent out little squads to kind of attack the Confederate line instead of ordering that general assault. Finally, the sun started setting again, and Sherman, he just knew by sunrise the Confederates would have retreated into cover of darkness and he'd have the field. Well, when dawn came, he saw the Confederate Army still standing there waiting for orders. Well, the fight raged on, despite a heavy rainstorm that had moved in. That day, on March 21st, Sherman, he almost got the upper hand and destroyed the Confederate Army right there in Bentonville. You see, one of his attacks cut off Johnston's retreat route that I was just talking about. And this would have blocked the Confederates in, and it would have more or less been a turkey shoot. Now, one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning of this episode is this area in Bentonville, it's kind of like a corridor. On one side, you got the Cape Fear River, and on the other side, it's a huge area of marsh. So there's only a certain lane, and it's several miles wide, but there's only a certain lane they can really go through. So that's what the importance is of, keeping that exit open, because it wouldn't be very hard to cut them off. Now, the benefits to having an area like this is if you get in the right spot, you can almost set up ambushes, and it's pretty easy to capture the enemy. Well, after Johnston realized that he was almost taken, he orders a counterattack and opens that door back up, opens that exit route back up pretty quick, and then he used that door just as fast as he could. C.S. Johnston got the heck out of there, and he headed for Smithfield. And that's the end of the Battle of Bentonville. Now, at that battle, the Union Army lost 1,527 men, and the Confederates lost 2,606. Johnston made it to Smithfield, and Sherman, he continued heading for Goldsboro, which was his plan all along. I don't think he ever really intended to go to Raleigh, like I said. Sherman reaches Goldsboro on March 23rd, and he meets up with U.S. Schofield. Now, this whole time that Sherman and Johnston have been going at each other down here in North Carolina, up in Virginia, General Grant was giving General Lee a hell of a fight in Petersburg. By the way, I've been to Petersburg battlefield. I highly recommend it. There's an area there they call the Battle of the Crater, and the crater in question is filled in over the years, but at the time of the battle, it was a huge crater. The Union Army, they dug a tunnel under the ground till they got underneath the Confederate line, or what they thought was a Confederate line. They set all this TNT. They blow this TNT up, hoping to kill most of the Confederates, and they don't, and it turns into a real problem. I would definitely look into the Battle of the Crater, but I'm not going to talk about that too much here. Anyway, on March 29th, 6 days after Sherman meets up with Schofield in Goldsboro, Lee pulls out of Petersburg, and again, Grant is hot on his heels. Lee heads for a small town called Appomattox Courthouse, where he's finally beaten into surrender, which he signed on April 9th. Also, I've been to Appomattox Courthouse, and it's absolutely beautiful up there. If you're ever driving in Virginia and a trooper doesn't have you pulled over somewhere, you should definitely check out Appomattox Courthouse. Anyway, back to North Carolina. A day after Lee surrendered in Virginia, Sherman continued his march down in North Carolina. Remember I said that Johnston retreated to Smithfield? Well, he didn't stop there. He and his men ran all the way to Greensboro. Meanwhile, Sherman actually was on his way to Raleigh by this point. It was around this time the news started to spread that Lee had surrendered up there. The Confederate Army had been beaten. The South had lost the Civil War. So, on April 17th, U.S. Sherman and C.S. Johnston met in Durham at the Bennett Farm and began negotiating surrender. It took a little bit of negotiating, but they finally came to some terms. Now, I talked about the Bennett place in my Hillsborough episode 12. The Bennett Farm is outside of Hillsborough in Durham County, but it still came up. The terms of the surrender were almost identical to the ones that General Grant gave General Lee. All said, 90,000 Confederate troops in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida were all surrendered. It was the largest surrender of the Civil War. And one more thing about the Bennett Farm, it's not incredibly far from my house. I'd say probably within an hour's drive. So at some point, I'd like to get up to the what they call the Bennett place, and I might do some recording up there for you. On April 30th, Sherman continued his march, but this time he wasn't blowing up railroad tracks and burning bridges. He was headed to Washington, D.C. for the end of the war ceremonies. He finally made it in late May, and on May 24th, Sherman participated in the Grand Review. But that's the Battle of Bentonville. And as you can see, I did want to talk about the Battle of Bentonville, but I feel like I would have been remiss if I didn't give you all the stuff leading up to it and a few details after the fact. And I want to say there were some small skirmishes with Johnston's army in other places in North Carolina as they were trying to chase down Sherman's men. I didn't mention all the little skirmishes, so some of you major historians might be, scratching your head. Those may come up in other episodes. For this episode, I'm wanted to really focus on Bentonville and the stuff leading up to this major battle here. So if you really want me to talk about some of these smaller skirmishes, hit that contact button and suggest it, and I'll put them in here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the show. Check the link below and check out my interview with Brian and John. One last thing I wanted to throw in here. I'm recording this after the fact, so I don't know which order it's going to be in, so sorry if this pops up as kind of random. I didn't mean for this to happen, but it just worked out that if this episode goes out on time when I intend for it to go out, then this episode will come out the day before the actual Battle of Bentonville started back in 1865. It'll be March 18th. So if you're listening to this on the day it actually comes out, then the Battle of Bentonville started tomorrow, 158 years ago. And like I said, if you like the show, subscribe, rate, and review. Check out the Facebook group. Check out the website. I think that's everything. And so I'll talk to you in a couple weeks.